Hello everyone. Today's lecture is about the Bronze Age in the Mediterranean world. This is an area where a great deal of the seeds of what gets termed the classical world, that of Greece and Rome, the seeds of a lot of those traditions and concepts began during this time period and in this region. If we want to define Mediterranean, it's pretty basic to define the sea itself, right? At least since the end of the last ice age. But that's not really what we're talking about when we talk about the Mediterranean world. Essentially, if we want to take some well-accepted concepts by researchers working in the area, we would say that rainfall and temperature patterns allowing for olive cultivation are one of the principal ways you could map this on the landscape. And in this region, you really have a dependence of people's economics, especially during the Bronze Age, on the agricultural cultivation of grains, grapevines, and olives, the Mediterranean triad. Similar to the three sisters of Mesoamerican, North American agriculture, maize, beans, and squash, right? One of the difficulties with this region, and something that has obscured a great deal of the diversity and depth of history, is the overwhelming visibility of Greece and Rome from a European/American point of view. And that has, I think, prevented many people from a deeper and more complete appreciation for this history. The Bronze Age here begins around 3500 BCE. We've already talked about the Neolithic and a little bit about the Chalcolithic that followed that, but the Bronze Age is really where we see the beginnings of a coalescence of traditions, concepts, subsistence practices, and technologies that would later become the root, if you will, of many of the more recognizable civilizations of the Near East and Mediterranean. What we see during this time period is a development and proliferation of sophisticated metallurgical technology that was more extensive and refined than the earlier use of softer metals like copper, silver, and gold. The advances that we see happening here and during this time period involve the smelting and alloying of multiple metals in mixtures that enhance their properties both for casting and forging. What's kind of interesting, though, is that the very beginning of this time period did not see major population growth or significant changes in the structure of communities. And this is a big contrast to the huge changes seen in places like the Far East. Recall the transformations that took place in Japan upon the introduction of the bronze technology at the beginning of the Yayoi period. Huge transformations, both in technology, settlement pattern, population density, and all of that. So the transitions in technology have different impacts in different regions because there's different particular historical trajectories that are modified, thrown off course, enhanced by similar kinds of developments are going to have different impacts in different areas, I guess, is the bottom line. Where do we see the emergence of social inequality in the Mediterranean? What's really kind of interesting here, and a fascinating and understudied component of it, is that the earliest evidence for this is not in the most fertile or productive regions. In this case of the Mediterranean, you see the first social inequality really taking hold in suboptimal, arid, and insular island contexts. This is in stark contrast to what we were seeing in the Yangtze and Huanghe rivers in China, for example. where it was these places with the most productive landscapes and the highest density of populations, the greatest ability to marshal numbers and resources, where you saw the emergence of these kernels of later hierarchical and state-level societies. It's not the case in the Mediterranean. It's also odd that in the Mediterranean you don't see the development of this social inequality in immediate proximity to the large and earlier states of Egypt and Mesopotamia, at least in terms of landscape. Now, this may relate, in the case of Egypt, to the fact that Egypt occupies that whole river valley all the way down to the Third Cataract, right? Even from an earlier date. And to the east and west of the Nile Valley itself, apart from the Fayum Oasis, there's very little that could support any kind of comparable development until you get many, hundreds of miles away, certainly to the west. And you see a landscape, certainly in the area that is today Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the Levant, right, is kind of betwixt and between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Hittites and Assyrians of Anatolia. So that portion of the landscape may simply be getting pulled in too many different directions. That may be why you don't see the development in that area. But still, it is interesting that you see the earliest social inequality in what is today considered Europe on the island of Crete and in Nuragic Sardinia, to the west of Italy. You can see it there on the map. A little bit later. These two places you see, clear evidence for the development of hierarchical societies first. It's a really fascinating question to ask, why might this be, and to try to understand that. Regardless of the answer, it is important to emphasize that there were a number of historical trajectories of social development in the Mediterranean region. There's not a one-size-fits-all explanation here. Given that, we'll have to, I think, focus a little bit on certain areas of the Mediterranean today in our lecture, rather than trying to embrace the whole thing within the context of this course and the time we have available. So the Aegean. This is an excellent map showing the Aegean world in the Bronze Age. It shows some major things I want you to be able to recognize the locations of. Obviously, you see Greece here on the left-hand side of the map with its large southern peninsula, the Peloponnesus. You see other Greek areas, Boeotia, Athens, Mount Olympus there up in the north. Very, very important for moving forward in our discussion here today is going to be this large island of Crete and the Cycladic Islands to the north of that. You can see along the coast of Anatolia, what is today Turkey, other islands you may have heard of, including Rhodes, the island of Rhodes, the Colossus of Rhodes was there at one point. Up in the northeast part of the Aegean, you can see the location of Troy, location known today in Turkey as Hisarlik, and the straits, the Bosporus, and the Sea of Marmara, and the Black Sea there going through that strait. Really important portions of the landscape to keep in mind. So, Crete, right? Before around 2500 BCE, we see relatively small settlements with very patchy evidence for marked distinctions within society. Interestingly enough, though, during this time period, you see grave goods, and one of the really cool ones, and I was unable to locate a photo that was worthy of this, are these riveted daggers that are made of arsenical copper and sealstone. So it's arsenic and copper, two metals combined, but not fully smelted in the way that we'd be looking at with bronze. And seal stones, basically these stones that are used for impressing in clay or wax to make a distinctive mark. And both of these things are indicative of individual status. Around this same time period, these patterns begin to fade in parallel to increasing contact with Egypt and the Levantine city-states like Byblos. And the exotic trade goods, so trade goods brought in from outside of Crete, that are found in sites on the island over the next few centuries include things like Near Eastern silver cylinder seals, hippopotamus ivory, Egyptian-type stone bowls, scarabs, faience, glass, lapis lazuli, and other semi-precious stones. And the points of origin for these items is very, very much to the east, through the city-states of the Levant and Canaan and Egypt. That's where this stuff is coming from. So heavily influenced during this early time period by its trading partners to the east on the mainland, rather than towards the north. The emergent individuals on Crete, the wealthy and powerful, or those at least who imagine themselves to be wealthy and powerful and are trying to expand their wealth and power, likely used these exotic imports to establish their identity and demonstrate their ties to foreign politicians and merchants and to legitimize their authority to rule. But this was not fully developed at this point. So this was emergent inequality, if you will. And so there was likely, the reason why it seems a bit fuzzy is there was likely pushback at a number of different levels by various components within society. It's not just like somebody who's wealthy and powerful says, I'm wealthy and powerful, and we all just fall down in front of them. So there was undoubtedly some tension within society during this time period. It's also likely that control over the access to these status symbols was used to manipulate local artists, craftspeople, merchants, and other members of a middle class, if you will, to support the efforts of the emerging elite to establish their power within Cretan society. To the north of Crete, the Cycladic Islands, these very small, rocky islands, we see a pattern similar to that on Crete, but they're very unlikely places if you just sort of look at the resources and size of farmland and available timber and all of that. Very unlikely place for these early complex societies to develop. Interestingly enough, the pure white marble of these islands was used to make vases and anthropomorphic figures widely traded in the Aegean, and which have even inspired some modern artists. You see the beginnings of a social and economic system in the Cyclades founded primarily on trade and interaction. Because the local populations on these islands can't produce anywhere near enough surplus in the way of grain and agricultural products to base the economic system just on that. And there's not nearly enough locally produced surplus to found a social system. Even those beautiful statues and carvings, while artistically commendable, are not enough to found a sociopolitical system on. So it's all about this interaction between islands, between the islands and the mainlands, engaging with this larger system. There is evidence, both material and artistic. Note the frying pan vessel representations in your textbook. That strongly indicates that the construction of large ocean-going ships had already been mastered well before 2500 BCE. So over 4,500 years ago, they were already making large, seaworthy vessels. On the Greek mainland and Troy, we can talk a little bit here about that. It's a whole nother lecture to discuss just Troy itself, and you can see partly why in this illustration on the right. You've got 9 different layers of Troy, 10 if you will, on the hill of Hissarlik, and only one of them was the Troy from the Trojan War, right? But this occupation goes all the way back to this time period, 2500 BCE. And so when you have well over 3,000 years of occupation, there's a great deal to unpack and discuss. So we unfortunately won't be able to get into a huge amount of detail about that particular site in the lecture today. In a general trend, though, it's part of a larger process. Sir Colin Renfrew has noted that the mid-3rd millennium BCE, he calls it, and had an international spirit. And this whole region of the Eastern Mediterranean started a process of integration that linked different areas, traditions, communities into sustained and meaningful contact in ways that hadn't operated before. And this led, through time, to the formation of one of the first world systems. An early version of globalization is one way to think about it. For example, you get the Cycladic marble figurines and pottery are found at Troy and other parts of the Northeast Aegean, while you get really distinctive mainland types of ceramics found at Cycladic and Cretan sites and even at Troy itself. And so this Eastern Mediterranean, especially the Aegean, rather than looking at this as a barrier, you just think about the Aegean. That sea actually served to connect all of these different societies, especially given the fact that they have the transportation technology of these large seafaring ships, able to carry large numbers of people and goods between these different areas. And so the sea was no longer a barrier, it was a road, it was a highway, it was a superhighway of the Bronze Age in the Aegean. Returning and talking some more about Minoan Crete, right? Obviously you have the very early Bronze Age developments there that we already talked about with the riveted daggers and the early emergent systems of inequality. But it doesn't really follow your standard track of the development, first of emergent inequality, and then god kings, and then pyramids, and all of that. Minoan Crete has a different history. Here we see an excellent map of Crete showing the locations of some of the major palaces, as we'll talk about here in a second, as well as some of the villas, other sacred caves and mountain shrines that we'll talk about here in the lecture moving forward. There's been less work done in the western part of the island, which is why you see a little bit of a difference in distribution, but these, even so, the center of occupation on Crete was the site of Knossos. This was the largest of all of the complexes. The Palace period, from about 2000 BCE until the end of Minoan civilization, about 1490 BCE. And as I was kind of putting it in rabbit ear quotation marks earlier, palaces is the word used. but it really shouldn't be taken as a residence of a king, and perhaps regional administrative center would be more accurate. But palace sounds more exciting, doesn't it? These are the reasons why sometimes things get names that they don't necessarily merit. But they do not appear to have been the residences of King Minos, like from the legends, right? They vary from region to region of Crete, and even in some of the outlying Minoan colonies. But they share some important features. And the specific ones that they share, they are monumental in scale. I mean, this illustration is actually pretty effective because it shows people in this context. This is a very large architectural structure. They're monumental in scale. As you can also see, they lack defensive walls. This looks more like, a university campus than a medieval castle, right? There's always a large open-air central court that you can see there towards the top of the image. Residential quarters. People were living here, certainly, but they're like many of these are dorm room type residential quarters. There are also numerous spaces for entertainment and or ritual performances, not just the large open-air plaza, but other sort of side rooms for different kinds of performances, etc. And what's really remarkable are some of the brightly frescoed walls and columns. These were incredibly exuberantly decorated and painted. Here's some examples here. Fresco means you have wet plaster that's applied to the wall, and then the pigment is painted on before the plaster dries. And so it requires a great deal of artistic skill, but also planning, especially when you see the precision with which many of these are done. You can see there on the left, that's probably a portion of an octopus. Those are the tentacles, right? A really neat one in the top center of this image is these are monkeys. There's no monkeys on Crete, so clearly this was an artist that had been elsewhere and seen these critters and found them interesting and artistically worth examining. You can see these pictures of two young boys boxing. You can see the top right, some water servers. You can see kind of the scale of the murals on the walls, floor to ceiling. A few more I just can't quite, resist showing. This one on the right, where the fisherman has his catch, just always reminds me of the fact that the Minoans were very much a maritime society. And you can see that one beautiful one of the dolphins there, and the flying fish in the bottom center. Top left, a woman harvesting plants. Just the gracefulness of this and the representation of different aspects of clothing and everything. Just really beautiful art. Another interesting thing that you see at these quote-unquote palaces, is just huge storage facilities. And this really strongly suggests that these building complexes were where the Minoans were collecting, storing, and then redistributing a lot of staple goods to the surrounding areas. And you have here a good image showing these pithoi, which are these large storage jars. Chemical analysis of which indicates that olive oil and wine were among the goods being stored here. So you've got grain and olive oil and wine and all kinds of other things that are being brought to these administrative centers and stored here perhaps for redistribution elsewhere, because the amount of consumption that's going on immediately at these facilities does not match anywhere the amount that they are storing at these locations. There's just not enough people living there to merit that much. One of the other indicators that these quote-unquote palaces are administrative centers more than the residences of kings is the frequency of these different seals and sealings, the development of two forms of writing, both hieroglyphic, likely inspired by the contacts with Egypt, and linear A, shown example there on the top right. This writing emerged as administrative tools to account for the different commodities and their collection and distribution. Whatever the interpretation, it's clear that Minoan palaces were multifunctional spaces. And here's one of the longest linear texts in Minoan Linear A. This is the Phaistos disc. And what's really interesting, this will blow you away, we don't know what it says. We can't read Linear A. And we know it's a written language. We know it's likely associated with these administrative functions, but it has not been fully translated. We just don't know. Part of it is because we don't know what language the Minoans spoke. They do not appear to have spoken Greek or Egyptian. So they spoke some other language. Which one? It would be, fascinating to learn and figure out. Minoan politics. Early 20th century people assumed that, early 20th century archaeologists, I should say, assumed that elite persons, like kings and queens, who were living in these quote-unquote palaces. And as we pointed out, that's not true. The authority and control in society, interestingly enough, appear to have not been centralized in the palaces. They appear to have been serving a function within society rather than dictating what's being done in society, which is kind of neat. There appears to have been a good deal of factional competition among high-ranking family groups who lived in areas of the communities outside the quote-unquote palaces, right? So there seems to have been a whole lot of competitive feasting, gift-giving, different families and groups establishing trade monopolies over certain luxury items, and a lot of jockeying for position was a main occupation for these powerful families within Minoan society. One better analogy for Minoan politics might be Renaissance Italian city-states like Florence or Venice. So if you've seen any of those shows about the Medicis or whatnot, something along those lines might be a parallel to what it was like in these Minoan cities. So it appears that they were held together more by ideologies, cosmologies, ritual, and economics than by political authoritarianism. Remember, if you will, or when you get to the lecture on Theseus and the Minotaur, that the later Greek myths assert that Crete and King Minos had a thalassocracy. They rule of the sea and controlled the eastern Mediterranean and demanded all kinds of tribute from the cities around there. Whether even the island of Crete itself was unified under the authority of Knossos is not entirely certain. And it may have varied over time. Remember, the Minoans were a going concern for well over 600 years. So at different points in time, there may have been greater or lesser unity within and between those societies. Whatever the political structure was, and here's the bottom line about this, it is very important to note that the first Mediterranean representations of plank-built ships with sails are those on carved seal stones dating to the time of the first quote-unquote palaces, or even a little bit earlier. These were the first maritime traders. These were the first mercantile-based systems in the Mediterranean world, without any question, and possibly the world at large. They are precocious in that instance. And so a economic system based on international trade is not something new, but the Minoans were the first ones to pioneer that route. What's really kind of cool is that we actually have Minoan ships. This is not just inferred or interpreted from sourcing stones to different locations. We actually have found a few of their actual ships, and the reconstruction shown there in the picture is a very good one. This is what a Minoan ship would have looked like. On the bottom, this is from a museum in Turkey, showing recreation of what the shipwreck found at Uluburun would have looked like when it was loaded with its cargo. Even more recently, in the Hisarunu Gulf off of Turkey, the oldest one, they have found a Minoan ship that dates even earlier than the Uluburun ship, and the new one dates to around 2000 BCE. So very much during the early quote-unquote palace period, during the height of Minoan power and uncontested rule of the Eastern Mediterranean. What's cool is that these shipwrecks empirically and emphatically demonstrate the fact that even at this very early date, the Minoans were central players in creating one of the first world systems, the coalescence of which leads to our modern globalization. What's neat is that in the cargo that these ships were carrying, you have copper from Cyprus and tin from the Western Mediterranean, malachite and turquoise from what is today Iran, ivory from sub-Saharan Africa, amber from the Baltic Sea, all the way up there north of Europe. Amber from there is coming down and making its way into the Minoan trade networks, as well as these local products of olive oil and wine that are being carried out to these places. Two places that can't produce olive oil and two places that can't produce wine. They become more valuable if you take them to places where people lack the local capacity to make them. Here's a map showing some of this, these routes that are coming in and then making their way into the Minoan world. Truly, truly remarkable how widespread and how precocious this is, at happening at such an early date, that they're able to bring this all together and create an economic system that later societies, later states would endeavor to emulate and recreate networks as truly cosmopolitan as that had been done by the Minoans over 4,000 years ago. It's really cool. Talking about Minoan religion is a little bit less clear. It's difficult to figure out what the exact outlines of their belief system are, given our inability to read Linear A. As time went on, the wealthy and powerful families and quote-unquote palace authorities increasingly sought to control religious power, which early on was more distributed and less centralized, right? The sanctuaries on those peaks that you saw on that map at the beginning of our discussion here are associated with architectural associations at the most adjacent palaces. So the palace is lined up so that it faces a particular sacred peak that has a shrine. And some of these shrines are more elaborate than others. And At these shrines, offerings are left and rituals are performed. You can see on the image there at the bottom left some of the examples of the things that would be left behind. Some of them seem to be associated with fertility. Others you can see are limbs, body parts. People may be leaving these, because they have an illness or they have an injury, and they're petitioning the supernatural to aid them. And this is not that dissimilar from some traditions that you see in different parts of the world today. And there on the top left, you can see a reconstruction of what one of these peak sanctuaries might have looked like. So not huge. This is in contrast to the administrative centers. The peak sanctuaries appear to have been relatively smaller in scale. You can see that's not large enough for even a few dozen people to comfortably occupy. This is a different kind of ritual tradition than we see in places where you have these massive open-air performance spaces or pyramids or ziggurats. This is a different kind of relationship to the supernatural that's being expressed here in these peak sanctuaries that are very consistent throughout the Minoan world. In the sacred art, it's very, very prevalent. But that's the interesting thing. It's less restricted in access. It's less centralized both socially, in terms of social power, as well as where it's found in society. It seems to be more widely available to people. People seem to have had a more direct interaction with the sacred and with sacred art, at least during the palace period in Minoan society, than some of these other early traditions. Things that occur very prominently are these double axes. You can see in that image on the top right, the double axe, and bottom right as well is the gold seal from which that drawing is made. The double axe is also known as the labrys, and that's where the term labyrinth gets its name, and its association with the cult of the bull. You can see top left the prominence of the bull in Minoan art. Also figurines of women grasping snakes. Women in general are frequent, and their prominent place in both sacred art and in Minoan society is notable, especially, again, compared to some of the other traditions in the Aegean and later time periods. The Greek traditions, for example, don't have nearly as prominent a place for women. You can see in some of these images here, the only people represented are women. And the bulls, right? The bull jumping. This is also part of the Theseus and Minotaur myth. This is a remarkable mural. There's one in Knossos, one at Akrotiri. There's also one at Avaris. So this was a very frequent subject matter for these murals to being painted. And you think, my, that's remarkable. How could that, actually happen? Maybe it's just mythological. Well, I bring you here. You can see on the top right the recortadores of Spain and southwest France, prominent areas near the Pyrenees in the western Mediterranean. It's performed by both men and women, as shown in the art from the Minoan period as well. The bull, interestingly enough, is not killed as part of the competition. And skill, acrobatics, and style are the key ways that you earn points. Check out this video right here. I will also post this to the Canvas site. But make sure you compare the sequence starting at minute mark 145 on that video there to the image in the Minoan fresco on the previous slide. Also, you can see this cast bronze image of a bull jumper and the similarities between the recortadores of today and what the Minoans were doing over 4,000 years ago. Just, gives you goosebumps to think about that level of cultural continuity. Some of the other examples of bulls in art and prominent and remarkable representations of women and clothing and style. We're even able to pick out, we know so much about Minoan clothing from their own murals that we're able to see Minoans represented in other places, like in Egyptian murals and in Mesopotamia. That's a Minoan because see the cut of that particular piece of clothing. That's very distinctively Minoan. So the Minoans were actually going to Mesopotamia and the Levant and Egypt and meeting up with people so that people recognize what kinds of clothes they wore. And you can see bulls on ceramics, bulls as a ceramic vessel. That's a whole vessel for pouring out wine, is actually this head of this bull with these golden horns. You can see on the bottom left these bullhorn, sort of abstracted bullhorns that were placed along the tops of the Minoan buildings. Really remarkable. And then on the right, just kind of an artist's reconstruction of some of this bull jumping that may have occurred 4,000 years ago. So a remarkable society founded on international trade and with an artistic tradition and an architectural tradition and sewers and heated floors and all kinds of things in these remarkable structures. What happened? What stopped this society in its tracks? Because it did not really decline like some of the other ones that we've looked at. By the end of the Second Palace period, sometime around 1490 BC, probably a little bit earlier than that, that's like the end, all but one of the palaces on Crete were destroyed, as well as all the satellite villas in the countryside. A new administrative system was put in place. New ritual structures emerged. The old peaks, sanctuaries and caves, no more. New material culture was employed. New styles, forms, ways of doing things. This is not Minoan society as it was known before. Much less prominence of women observed in art and public life. And most strikingly, Linear B, a new writing system based on Linear A, but now used to somewhat awkwardly write the Greek language of the mainland, which was totally distinct from what the Minoans spoke. Again, remember, we don't know what their language was. What happened? Was it an armed invasion by mainland Greeks? Or was it the 1560 BCE eruption of Thera? The eruption is categorized as ultra-Plinian. It ejected approximately 100 cubic kilometers of rock and magma into a 30 to 35 kilometer high eruption column, which reached the stratosphere and later fell as a rain of volcanic ash as far away as the Near East and Egypt. As the magma chamber collapsed underneath after this eruption on this island of Thera, the surrounding seawater poured in to the partially emptied crater, coming into instant direct contact with the magma. This produced violent phreatomagmatic blasts equivalent to over 300 megatons of TNT. You're talking about nuclear bomb level explosions. Earthquakes of between 8.8 and 9.7 repeatedly rocked the region as the phases of the eruption proceeded from bad to worse. All of this tectonic activity centered around the island of Thera produced repeated tsunamis between 35 and 150 meters. That's 115 to almost 500 feet high that devastated the northern coastline of Crete, only 68 miles away. So, what happened to the Minoan civilization? It was probably a combination of both the eruption of Thera, utterly destroying the coastal cities of Crete, and especially their navy, and their merchant fleet, which was the foundation not only of their ability to defend themselves and project power, but also to carry these necessary goods and services. It wiped it all out in a single stroke. After 1490 BCE, Crete is part of the Mycenaean sphere of influence. and loses its role as a center of social and cultural development in the Eastern Mediterranean. The impact of the cataclysm of the Thera eruption and the earthquakes and the tsunamis, that happened in a single stroke. The loss of power was something that probably took a couple of decades to work its way out, which is why there's kind of a lag between our known date for the eruption and where archaeologists end, quote-unquote, the palace period. But my guess would be is that the Minoans began to lose their autonomy as an independent society very shortly after the eruption of Thera. And it just wasn't until 50 years later that their whole writing system and language and material culture and traditions were swamped by the invading Greeks from the north. So this was a death blow followed by absorption into the Greek world, which is interesting because you've seen how much more closely the Minoans were tied into the Levant and Egypt. They've even recently found Sphinx statues, for example, at a couple of Minoan sites on Crete. So this was a complete shift. This event changed history, very literally. Had the Minoan civilization continued and the Greek mainland civilization not gained a boost by filling in that vacuum of merchants and traders and whatnot that the Minoans were filling, who knows how things might have gone differently. Here you can see a map of the regional distribution of tephra. This is the volcanic ash blown out by the Thera eruption. You can see how widely this has been discovered. This is empirical evidence for this blast. It was epic in scale. So speaking about Mycenaean Greece, after the Minoans, shortly before the eruption of Thera, a series of palace-based territorial kingdoms began to arise throughout the southern and central Greek mainland. And this is likely partly through interaction with the Minoans and in participation with that world system that's emerging of trade and exchange, both of goods and ideas, because some of what we actually know about the early Mycenaeans comes from Linear B tablets recovered from the island of Crete during that time period right after the collapse of Minoan society. This is interesting because this is the earliest case in the Aegean where readable written documents supplement archaeological evidence. The very first time. And the Mycenaeans had a very different kind of society to that created by the people of Crete, both in terms of social organization, gender relations, emphasis on defense and warfare. We'll talk about some of these things here. Here you can see one of these Mycenaean tombs, which are really strong indicators of the degree of social and political stratification in Mycenaean society. These massive tombs. Some of them are smaller rock-cut chambers, but these elaborate beehive-shaped tombs, reserved only for the highest-ranking members of society, are really, really clear markers that we're talking about a society with a great deal more centralization of power and wealth in the hands of a very few than we saw in Minoan society. In life, the individuals buried in these tombs resided in true palaces within walled and fortified citadels surrounded by the towns that supported them. So much more similar to the concepts that we think of a medieval castle with a town around it. Much closer to that, the Mycenaean towns, than anything that the Minoans were doing. The Mycenaeans, though, did have a strong tradition of engineering and built roads and bridges and dams, ports, all throughout their area of the mainland. And this demonstrates the existence during this time here of state-directed development projects. The scale of some of these things admits no other possibility. Mycenae itself, in the northeastern Peloponnese, has been associated, even since classical Greek times, with Agamemnon and the Trojan War, most notably by way of Homer's Iliad. That gold mask that you see there is a funerary mask placed on a burial that was recovered by Heinrich Schliemann in his excavations at Mycenae after his excavations at Troy. And he's the one who referred to this as the Mask of Agamemnon. There's no actual evidence to support that this was Agamemnon's mask, and probably dates to a slightly earlier time period than the Trojan War, so highly unlikely that it was actually on King Agamemnon of Trojan War fame. The site itself, the city itself, sat on a commanding hill, and contrasting again with the Minoan cities, was defended by massive walls of Cyclopean masonry. This is what they refer to in the Eastern Mediterranean, Cyclopean masonry, these large, enormous blocks of stone, rather than many small blocks used to create these walls. Virtually impenetrable to any of the siege weaponry of the day, of the early Bronze Age, certainly. And what you see here on the right is the famous Lion Gate from the site of Mycenae. These Mycenaean palaces all had throne rooms, referred to as megarons. They're these three-room structures with a hearth and clearly designed for receiving the court, if you will, of the king or queen, as it may have been. The general consensus among archaeologists is that Mycenae was the center of a kingdom. But there's a bunch of other contemporary sites, Tiryns, Pylos, that were almost certainly the centers of their own small kingdoms. So those descriptions from the Iliad of Mycenae and Thebes and Pylos and Ithaca all being somewhat independent of one another and having to forge these different alliances just to be able to go and fight the Trojans for stealing Helen is actually probably a reasonable representation of the political fragmentation of Mycenaean Greece. Very recently, at the site of Pylos, you find that in 2015, they found the grave of what they referred to as the Griffin Warrior, and dates to about 1450 BCE, indicating a really, really quick development of inequality in Mycenaean society. It's astonishingly rich, and the fact that it's remained unlooted for this long is pretty impressive. You can see here a portion of a comb, a painted bone comb. You can see a carnelian seal with a Minoan-style bull on it there. You can see his sword here, the hilt of his sword on the right, and a map showing both the location there in the southwest part of the Peloponnese and the tomb itself. So remarkable discoveries of Mycenaean stuff is still happening today, and giving us even greater insight into the emergence of what one could argue was the first identifiable European civilizational structure. Mycenaean influence, interestingly enough, it's seemingly not as far-reaching as that of the Minoans, but likely much more direct. There was a complex network of exchange, diplomacy, and conquest that involved societies from across the entire Eastern Mediterranean basin. Shown on the map here, the areas that were heavily influenced and or controlled by the various Mycenaean city-states, right, also shown here, parts of coastal Anatolia, the islands of the Dodecanese, the island of Cyprus, and as mentioned earlier, the island of Crete. This was the Mediterranean during the period of the Trojan War, and this was where the Greeks, quote unquote, of the Trojan War were living. Speaking of that, the fascinating thing about this is that it appears to have been a tale, a legend about conflicts that actually occurred. Whether they occurred for the reasons stated in the poetry of Homer, or whether it had more to do with what a lot of the later conflicts in the Mediterranean basin had to do with, access to trade routes and grain supplies and markets and luxury goods, and establishing power and wealth among these Bronze Age small kingdom leaders. I would venture to say probably one of those explanations is a little bit more likely in terms of the real history behind it. But again, much like we were talking about with regard to the Labyrinth and the Minotaur and the Amazons and Atlantis and the eruption of Thera, this too was something that actually happened. There was actually conflict between these different Aegean city-states, and Troy itself did fall prior to the fall of the Mycenaean city-states, which, interestingly enough, and ironically, and in parallel to what we see in the Odyssey, right, the end of Mycenaean power coincides with the century following the supposed dates of the victory of the Greeks over the Trojans. So yes, they won, but then their own city-states began to collapse shortly afterwards. Really, really fascinating how that literary tradition picked up on some of these things that we're now finding out are not entirely without basis in fact. So the end of the Aegean Bronze Age. During the 13th century BCE, so the 1400s, right, BC, the citadels of Mycenae and Tiryns, along with a number of other Mycenaean sites, show signs of major architectural investment in building up their fortifications, especially against siege warfare. Remember what happened to Troy, anyone? And there's also a whole bunch of other crises occurring during this time period. You see increased warfare between the Mycenaean kingdoms. There's also indicators at a number of sites of internal unrest, if you want to term it that way, among the large peasant populations. Maybe they got tired of being poor while King Agamemnon lived in his palace. And we see evidence for the internal breakdown of these structures of inequality, as well as a number of crop failures occurring going towards the 1200s. And that period between about 1200 to 1050 BCE was characterized by even larger regional instability. You had the collapse of several major powers, including the Hittites, and large-scale population movements. One example of this are the Sea People, mentioned throughout accounts of the Eastern Mediterranean, including Egyptian documents, and they're described as a large group of displaced people migrating and searching for new homelands. And this population movement undoubtedly caused disruption, but it's also driven by these larger systems at work, both climate systems as well as collapsing economic systems. The Dorians began to move south into the Greek mainland, also around this time, creating further conflict for the Mycenaeans. And it's interesting that, as described in the Odyssey, which is the sequel to the Iliad, the aftermath of the greatest victory of the Mycenaeans was not something that most of them enjoyed for very long. Most of the Mycenaean city-states were destroyed by 1100 BCE. A couple held on longer, but eventually by 1050 BCE, the last of the Mycenaean city-states collapsed and fell. This system, this Mycenaean system of palace-centered luxury craft production, monumental burials, elaborately decorated architecture, massive fortifications, and the use of writing disappeared, and their history began to pass into myth and legend. The end of the second millennium BCE began a dark age that lasted for at least 3 centuries. And during this time, regional population dropped dramatically. So it's not just that we no longer have written records for that time period, but populations fall, trade falls. I mean, it's truly, truly a dark age following the collapse of the Mycenaean city-states for the Aegean. Coming out of this dark age required the development of a number of really important concepts, including that of the Greek polis, or city, concepts of citizenship, and a shared Hellenic identity that transcended the boundaries of political states. It was not the Dark Age that produced these developments. It was the development of these structures, concepts, and ideals that allowed Aegean society to recover from the Mycenaean collapse. And as happens throughout history, a new day then began to dawn. We'll talk more about that later in the semester. Have a good day. I hope you guys are well.